undergraduate institutions and R1 or research intensive institutions are two types of places where people do science and train to be scientists. And so here is more about what these are, some comparisons between the two, and some things to keep in mind when you might be trying to decide where you want to go for your undergraduate scientific education. PUI stands for Primarily Undergraduate Institution, and it's a college or university where typically the mostly undergrads, there might be some master's programs, but the main emphasis tends to be on teaching. Research is still done often, but this research is going to be slower paced. The key aim of training students via the research rather than actually making big discoveries. And so if you make big discoveries, that's great. But it's also really great if you just give undergrads experience with research and teach them what is involved with research, allow them to have really interactive experiences in the lab. The kind of opposite of a PUI is an R1 institution. This is going to be a research intensive institution that gives out graduate degrees. The main emphasis here is going to be on the research. This research is often going to be fast-paced with the key aim of making big discoveries and things like that. So they'll have doctoral programs. They'll typically have postdocs, staff scientists, all this stuff, things that you wouldn't really find in a primarily undergraduate institution where the undergrads are really kind of running the lab. By running the show, I'm talking about just like the day-to-day experiments and with a lot of mentorship. So at a PUI, the professors often are actively involved in the lab work. So they're actually at the bench with students. And this is one of the reasons I really want to teach at a PUI is because I love helping give people their first lab experiences. At an R1 institution, it's going to vary a lot. Some professors are more hands-on, but typically they're going to be focused on other obligations like getting the grants to fund all the research that people are doing and steering the ship in terms of the broader directions of the lab. And helping the trainees design experiments and this sort of thing, but not actually doing them with them. Sometimes newer professors will spend more time at the bench, but then all the other obligations get to them. But again, it's going to vary from place to place. And when you're choosing a lab, you want to choose, make sure that the style of the PI, of the lab head, the professor, matches what's optimal for you. And there's also R2. So these are classified as having high as opposed to very high research activity, which brings me to the point that although we use the term R1 pretty loosely to refer to a research intensive environment, it's actually a technical classification with a specific definition. So these classifications come from this like Carnegie Classification of Institutions of Higher Education, which is this like whole big classification scheme that I didn't really even know existed. They have all these complicated flowcharts and things like this to describe how they go about classifying various colleges and universities and institutions. And basically for doctoral universities, so things that are conferring greater than or equal to 20 research doctoral or 30 professional doctoral degrees, they classify those as then like if they have a certain amount of doctorates then and a certain amount of funding, then they further classify those as research based on their research activity as R1 or R2. So R1 is going to be very high research activity and R2 is going to be high research activity. The specific definition is basically the university must have award at least 20 research or scholarship doctoral degrees in the update year, which is every few years. And they must spend at least $5 million in total research and score high in a research activity index calculation. So often universities are they want to be in the R1 list because that's like the best when it comes to the research in terms of prestige. but it's not necessarily the best when it comes to the experience you'll get as a student. And so I went to a PUI, I went to St. Mary's College of California, the small liberal arts school, and I had a fantastic experience. So I think it's a really, really great for undergrads to do research at a PUI when they really get more of a hands-on experience and they really get that independent research experience and the focus on teaching. But there are going to be fewer resources typically, so you're often not having direct access to that high-end equipment, those fancy new equipment. You're typically doing things a bit smaller scale, a bit more with like those classic techniques that you don't need a lot of infrastructure, you don't need a lot of fancy equipment to do, but you can still do some really, really cool experiments. So I'm a big advocate for PUIs when it comes to undergrads doing research. Although undergrads, you can still do research at a larger institution, but just don't count out those PUIs. Doing research as an undergrad at a PUI is an amazing experience, and I highly recommend it for undergrads. But there are a couple downsides, and one is that you're not exposed to like grad students and postdocs, and so you don't really get a sense of the whole scientific infrastructure at a place like an R1 institution. And so to get that sense, it can be helpful to do a research experience at an R1 or another research intensive institution over one of the summers. My professor, Jeff Sigmund, encouraged me to do this when I was an undergrad, and it ended up being a really beneficial experience that helped show me that I wanted to go to grad school and not med school. And so I'm really grateful for Dr. Sigmund pushing me to do that, and for all the great Dr. Finkbeiner for hosting me in his lab, and all the great people I interacted with who really helped introduce me to more of the like academia side of scientific research. And also another good thing that can be to go to scientific conferences to get a sense of the broader scientific environment, so you know more about these specific fields and techniques and things that you might not be exposed to at your PUI. But I really, really recommend people consider PUIs if they want to go. If they're thinking about doing science as an undergrad, even a liberal arts school. I went to a liberal arts school, and I'm a high fan of that. Bottom line, there are pros and cons to PUIs and R1s and all these different things. And ultimately, if you're approaching things as a student, you just need to figure out what's best for you. There are great training opportunities at R1s in addition to at PUIs. A lot of times you're getting some great mentorship, both from your PI as well as from other people in the lab. Additionally, at an R1, you'll have access to that higher end equipment typically, as well as you might have access to some higher division courses, a broader range of courses and things like this than you might have at a PUI. At a PUI, however, you might get a more independent, mentored but independent research project, so you might get a little more control of your research. You typically get more one-on-one attention from professors and things like this, but you're going to have less resources probably. Don't expect to have access to those fancy end machines, at least not directly. You might, through collaborations, government facilities and things like this, be able to access some of that equipment. But really the focus is going to be on learning. And so there are pros and cons to all of these, and really it's just a personal decision. And if you're approaching things as an undergrad, really just take into account what you value, what you want to get the most out of. Do you want to be on the cutting line of science, or do you want to be like learning more fundamentals and how to conduct science, and then maybe down the line you can go and work at one of those R1s. But remember that you might also want to get some experience at an R1, such as with the research opportunity over the summer. So pros, cons, I'm not saying one's better than the other. They all have great things to offer, and it's really just a personal decision, and hopefully you find a place that's your happy fit if that's what you're looking for. So if you go to like the Wikipedia page for research universities in the US, basically you can see the ones that are R1 universities, and then they have the ones that are R2 universities. So these are the high research activity. So I guess they don't spend as quite as much money on their research, or they otherwise have fewer degrees, things like this, something that is going to make it so that it's high, but not very high. So you see a lot of institutions here. And then some institutions where they don't, either they don't offer the certain number of degrees, or they don't spend enough money or something like this in their research expenditures. These can be classified as like special focus research institutions. And so I'm at UCSF, so the University of California, San Francisco, and you can see that it's located here. It's classified as one of these special focus research institutions. But a lot of places, like they say, like, oh, we consider UCSF as an R1 institution. So again, it's kind of loosely used. And then there are other just like research institutions which don't grant degrees, but they act more like an R1 in terms of the level of research done. They may or may not have graduate programs, such as where I went, Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, where I did my doctoral work. That'd be a research institution that also has a small graduate program. But in terms of the level of intensity of the research and stuff, it's kind of similar to an R1. So the classification, if you want to get all technical about it, then you can look at that Carnegie Classification scheme, which gets kind of confusing, and they have a lot of different classifications. But I guess it's useful for some things. Don't confuse R1 with R01. So in R1, this is what we're talking about, these research-intensive graduate degree granting institutions. And R01, this is going to be a big research grant. And so often labs apply for these like R01 grants, and this is going to fund a big research project for the lab and fund a lot of research. It's a really big one. So often at a R1 university or an R1 institution, the heads of the labs, the PIs, are going to have R01 grants. And so both of these terms tend to come together, but R1 is referring to the institution and R01 is referring to these individual grants. So I hope that helps you understand the difference between a PUI, an R1, an R2, and a R01, which is not one of these classifications. And although R1 is a technical classification through that whole Carnegie scheme, we often just use this term kind of loosely to refer to a place where they do a lot of this high intensity research.